Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Sebnem Kalemli-Ozcan, who is Professor of Economics. She is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Her current research focuses on real and financial linkages in the global economy and the implications of such linkages on economic fluctuations and growth. Welcome, Sebnem.
Hi, Jill. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with your recent paper, The Economic Case for Global Vaccinations, an epidemiological model with international production networks, in which you say COVID-19 pandemic had a devastating effect on both lives and livelihoods in 2020. The arrival of effective vaccines can be a major game changer. However, vaccines are in short supply as of early 2021, and most of them are reserved for the advanced economies. I've been thinking about this, Sebnem. I grew up in India, and my parents still live there. And when we think about a worldwide pandemic, and as you very clearly shown in your paper in detail, that we have 8.3 billion people, we have 200 or so countries. It is not 1918 anymore. I don't know, some world leaders may not know this, but we have gone 100 years forward, and we don't have segmented economies. We have a very connected system. And so it is sort of incredulous that world leaders think that they can get their countries vaccinated and go on from there, right? So what do you find in your paper here?
Yeah, that's exactly the point, Jill. So we start from the, very clear observation that we do live in a globalized world. Countries are connected to each other through trade and financial linkages. And this world, it wasn't invented yesterday. We have been living in this globalized world over the last 30 years. And this is not something you can just turn back with a flip of your finger overnight. I mean, you cannot just stop trade and finance, even though now there is a lot of talk about it, about this kind of backlash to globalization. So we are saying, like, look, we are starting from this point. We are living in this globalized world, and we have to make sure we use the powers of that globalization to solve the pandemic. I mean, we understand globalization amplified the pandemic because at the end of the day, this is a virus that travels from country to country. But we also realize that globalization is the only solution to the pandemic. We have to make sure these linkages between countries in terms of trade and finance works for eliminating the pandemic and works for recovering every economy. So in fact, our motto in the paper is no economy recovers until every economy does. So, I mean, clearly there is an ethical and moral case to be made on the human side, obviously, I mean, what is going on right now in the world, especially in India, is beyond heartbreaking. So we thought that case is just so clear that, we should write the economic case just to make the point that, look, I mean, clearly, we have a moral and ethical responsibility to stop the virus everywhere, but we are going to tell you that this is also in your best economic interest. This message is for rich countries to basically share the vaccines, stop the pandemic everywhere in the world is going to help you economically. Actually, if you don't do that, rich countries, your economy is not going to recover. So all these news now we have in terms of US recovering, and other advanced economies are on their way to recovery. This is going to cut short. I mean, the numbers, how much are in trillions, and those are the numbers we show in the paper. And then the reason is very simple. Yes, US can eliminate the virus, open all the restaurants, gyms, and all that, but the US also exports a lot. So its economy depends on export driven. If the rest of the world is sick, if those countries are sick, they are going to be in recession and they are not going to buy US products. And on top of that, US also imports a lot of intermediate products to produce. I mean, look what is happening, right? Car production came to a stop in the US because of the chip shortage. Now the semiconductor shortage is going to create a bigger havoc in terms of a lot of durable and electrical appliances. So that means those productions are not going to be at its regular scale and pace in the US and other advanced countries. Why is that? Because again, the other countries are sick and they cannot send you those intermediate inputs because they cannot produce those because their workers are sick. So these export and import linkages, which is trade linkages and production linkages, this is not just trade, but this is also something about your production in your country, is going to lead you lost economically, again, billions and trillions of dollars if the pandemic is not stopped everywhere. And of course, the way to do that is the vaccines, and this is what we do in the paper. We assume all the advanced countries are vaccinated. US, Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all these countries are vaccinated in 2021. But the rest of the world, basically emerging markets and developing economies like India, Brazil, Turkey, they are not vaccinated. Yeah. And if you have this scenario, what is the cost economically to those advanced countries? Those are the numbers we estimate.
Yeah. And so ethical and moral considerations are good, but you're making a strong economic argument in the paper. So I mean, it's a very intuitive argument, Sebnem. I don't know a lot about world leaders. What we have seen is that large countries, large democratic countries that have sort of, I don't know how to explain it, but leaders from yesteryear, so to speak. I'm not hitting on their age, but perhaps they don't have a good understanding of how the world works. Have had a great difficulty managing this, and so if you go back to sort of the implementation, we understand a system with 8.3 billion people is not going to be cured by localization, by segmentation. And even those who don't understand the economic models deeply can understand that intuitively. And so from an implementation perspective, I think we are, back to United Nations. Do you see one of the problems is that we don't really have an organization who has the capabilities and resources to actually take this up? Do you see that is a sort of the bigger problem?
I mean, I think we do have the resources and the capabilities and know-how. I mean, we have it all in terms of the world scale. I mean, if you think about it, we found the vaccine in a year. I mean, this is a record pace, right? So the problem has been and still is basically this lack of leadership and not having a vision. I mean, early on, obviously, countries who kind of realize, okay, we have to get these vaccine supplies to my own citizen. They sign up, they order these, vaccines, and then the others didn't. So this is, as you understand, this is not the money thing at this point. This is not about income. It's not about a rich poor country thing. It is literally about leadership and vision. And of course, the ones, some of those overdid, right? Some of those countries ordered multiples of their population because at that point they didn't know which vaccine is going to work. So, okay, fine. But now, after the fact that we know which vaccines are working, and if you have multiples of your population, clearly you have to give them away, right? And in fact, this recent move by the US, giving the AstraZenecas to other countries, and that's very good. But there are other countries like there's the UK, Israel, there's Canada. These countries also have multiples of their population. So first of all, they should definitely, this is no brainer, right? You should give those away because this is more than what you need in your country, number one. Number two, you have to fund COVAX. COVAX is an initiative exactly, established for this. It is a joint effort of WHO and the European Commission. They are directly contracting with companies like Pfizer, and they are buying from the companies and they are shipping off to the emerging markets and developing countries. And rich countries, and they are just asking money. They are not asking anything else. And rich countries gave to COVAX. I'm not saying they didn't, but they should give more. I mean, right now COVAX has like 40 billion or so opening in its budget, and then the cost we are estimating that rich countries are going to lose are in trillions. So it is no brainer that you should invest in COVAX. Okay, again, number one, you give away your extra supply. Number two, you invest in COVAX. Now, number three, you just make everything to increase the supply and production, right? I mean, if Moderna, Pfizer, if these vaccines are being produced in your country, just make do everything in your power to increase that supply, increase that production. Clearly, these export controls are not good ideas in this type of an environment. So, but you are right. I mean, I think we know how to do it, and we have the resources and capability, but we don't have the leadership. So, if you think about it, who is going to organize this, right? I mean, of course, first you think WHO. But WHO don't have that type of human power. So then the other name is immediately comes to your mind is G20, because G20 represents rich countries' governments, right? So for somehow that is the thing that I think was missing. Somehow countries are not getting together to organize and to manage this. At this point, it is all about increasing the supply and production. It is not about money, and it's not about a rich country, poor country thing. It's just that everything has been so slow, and everything, kind of coming behind. I mean, since the start of this pandemic, I mean, we were always behind, and the virus is always ahead. And what is happening in India right now also, I mean, it's a complete failure of leadership, right? And in fact, I think all these countries that are governed by these type of lack of vision, lack of leadership people, I'm telling, their people should hold these leaders accountable. All these strong men type of leaders, populist leaders, they should go. I mean, I don't understand what the people in these countries are doing when they go to vote, right? They should vote saying we don't want these people, because these people lack of vision, they lack leadership, and we don't want them to govern us. All these countries, I'm not just talking about India, Brazil, Turkey, all of them should do this. And in a way, actually, this is what Americans did, right? This is exactly what Americans did. They went to the booth and they said, no, we don't want Trump because he cannot handle the pandemic. I mean, pandemic is a great event that tests leadership and vision, right? And so many world leaders failed at that, and some didn't. So I think all countries should look at their leader, a very good look, and vote very diligently next time. But again, at this point, I think the whole thing is really rich countries should come together. I don't know if that body is going to be G20, WHO, but they should really fund COVAX. They should really do everything in their power to increase the supply and production. Otherwise, we will never get out of this.
Yeah. In 2009, Sebnem, in one of my books, I argued that men should not be put in charge of complex systems, for a variety of reasons. It's not just biological; it's also evolutionary, and they seem to fail when there is a discontinuity. They seem to do okay when things are sort of normal, and if they can play golf every day and stuff like that, they do pretty well. But in a discontinuity, it's much more difficult. And you can look at New Zealand, you can look at Taiwan, you can look at Germany, you can see leaders who have done exceptionally well in discontinuities, right? So as you say, there's a leadership problem. I don't know whether you touch on this in the paper, but there is also a timing issue here. This organism mutates, right? So we already have a variety of mutations that we have identified. And the number of mutations we will get is a function of the total viral load in the system. So if there is, 300 million people infected in India, for example, the number of mutations you will see is going to exponentially increase into the future. So there is a timing question. And so, Biden administration has done exceptionally well compared to the one before that, but they don't seem to have gotten this really well. So even if they get this now, it is still, I don't know what the net effect is going to be. Do you have that modeled into the in your paper?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. Timing is going to be important, right? So that's why every minute counts, right? Like, the more late we are, it's going to get exactly as you were saying, it's going to be in multiples. Now, in our model, we calculate everything for 2021. So the numbers we calculate, for example, that benchmark number of 4 trillion global loss from not vaccinating poor countries, even all the rich countries are vaccinated in 2021, and half of that is going to be paid by rich countries. That's a 2021 number. Now you push this forward in 2022, that 4 trillion number is going to go up, right? But the share of the rich countries is going to be the same. They are still going to be paying, half of that global cost, right? I mean, it can be even more than that, depending on how much they are going to earn. If their main trading partners are in really, really bad shape, then the cost to rich countries can increase. So we didn't, in that sense, we didn't work the timing out to see how many multiples of that increase will be. But definitely the timing is kind of there in the 2021 numbers, because we work 3 case scenarios there. One of them, the benchmark is, again, all the rich countries are fully vaccinated in 2021, but emerging markets and developing economies, poor countries, they are not. So this is the benchmark that gives you the 4 trillion number. But in the other scenarios, we assume worst case scenarios, like, only half of the populations of the rich countries are vaccinated, and emerging markets and developing economies have the this pandemic getting worse, like the third wave, exactly like what is happening in India right now. Then the numbers can go as high as to 9 trillion. In fact, this 9 trillion number is the one quoted by Dr. Tedros when I presented the work at the WHO press conference. So things can get really bad. We give you the really worst case scenario estimates to make sure everybody understands the economic case behind not doing vaccine nationalism and sharing the vaccines globally. So again, I mean, if you do add another year, everything is going to be multiplied. But here the crux of the issue is how bad the pandemic is going to be in the other countries, because we have an epidemiological model there, right? And we start running this model beginning of 2021. So we get the our numbers for every country, and we basically assign them to different sectors according to the physical proximity of jobs at the end of 2020, right? We get the numbers December 2020. That's when the vaccines are found, and then start evolving the pandemic in every country, right? So if this gets worse than what we assume in the evolution of the pandemic, of course, everything is going to be worse, right? The numbers are going to be high.
Yeah. So, Sebnem, let me ask you this. So if you were to rewind time, let's say rewind time by 15 months, and you have the opportunity to design an optimum policy at that point, what would that policy look like?
Yeah, so that would look like somehow immediately we had the, not actually immediately we had the vaccine news. Even before that, when vaccine companies were working on vaccines and these rich countries are buying all of them, that's why rich countries have a lot, right? At that point, capabilities for production should have been put into place. Exactly with the same mentality, right? Why rich countries bought Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & before even we knew if these are going to work or not, because this was a bet, right? Let me play on all the horses, whichever one wins, I will have that anyway because I'm paying it in advance. So same could have done for the production capacity, right? So assuming that one of these is going to work, I mean, we know how many people in the world, right? I mean, we have 6-7 billion, and there is going to be several doses for certain vaccines. So that type of production capacity should have been put into place very early on, so that once the raw materials, the inputs, and all that, so all that should have been studied. Again, that requires a central body, right? WHO, G20, I don't know who is going to do that. None of that is done. Everybody act on their own, and certain countries said, I'm going to buy all of these things in advance, and when one of them works, I will have the supplies. And the other countries said, I'm going to wait until I know which one works, then I'm going to do my order. Then of course it was too late. I mean, this, by the way, this is again not a rich country, poor country thing. Europe did the same mistake, right? So they also have a big problem right now.
Yeah, so I mean, we could have predicted that the intervention, the vaccines, would most likely be discovered in the U.S. Because of the large R&D infrastructure that's already in place. But you're talking about sort of the production infrastructure that had to be distributed for this to work, because we cannot cook up everything in New Jersey and then vaccinate 8.3 billion people.
Yeah,
it's unlikely to be effective. But then I guess in some sense it's easier said than done. How would you create a distributed production across the world?
Yeah, this is a very tough question. I mean, you're exactly right. So I believe the way to do that early on, yes, for example, countries like India should be at the center of it, because clearly you have to use countries with already large-scale production capacity. And how you do that in advance, even before knowing which vaccine is going to work, is very difficult. But somehow we do this in other rare commodities and important items. We do have these distribution networks, right? So I don't plan them. That's not my job, but I'm sure there are people who spend a lot of time in thinking about these distribution networks of important commodities in the world. So same type of care should have put in the vaccine production and distribution, which wasn't the case, but it was not done. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, pessimistically, this is just one iteration. We're going to see many of these types of things in the future. And so from a future policy perspective, from a United Nations perspective, COVAX was a good attempt, but it didn't seem to have worked. I don't know what the reasons are, but do we need to really sort of rethink the WHO and other UN organizations in anticipation? I mean, we missed the mark here.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll get over it. But 5 years down the road, we're going to face this again. So how would you suggest to sort of reorganize, restructure?
I mean, I fully agree. I mean, we have to rethink the international organizations that supposed to be on top of the public health, right? And clearly, next time this happens, and all the epidemiologists are telling us that this is going to keep happening, we need that very, centralized and very resourceful agency, right? I mean, this is exactly like on the economic side, IMF and World Bank. These institutions are very resourceful. They are powerful because they were built out of crisis, right? I mean, economic crisis, and they were very helpful in many other economic crises and economic issues since they were built. So now the same approach should have been applied to public health, and it cannot be a country level thing, right? I mean, it has to be a global thing. So I think you should just do same as we did with IMF and World Bank for public health version, and that I don't know what type of a body will that be, but obviously some combination of WHO, United Nations, but it has to be a institution with a lot of resources, a lot of connections, a lot of power somehow to be on top of these things. And at the start of this thing, WHO, couldn't even go to China. I mean, clearly, this is a joke, right? I mean, you can't deal with a worldwide global pandemic if you can't even go to the places where it started. So I envision an institution at the global level, but obviously every country should have offices of this institution and all that. And that's how IMF and World Bank works. Yeah. So
yeah. I was thinking, Sebnem, we have a organization in the United Nations called the Security Council. And if humanity were to advance, if Security Council's goal is to prevent people throwing ICBMs at each other, hopefully, that's something we can get over. But we're going to face worldwide issues like this, pandemics, meteor hits, other things. We have a group of countries there. They call themselves Security Council members, presumably because they are very special. And if they are special, don't they have a responsibility to step in and do something?
Yeah, I think everybody has a responsibility here, and they definitely have. But that Security Council is thought of under very different circumstances and for very different things, right? So, but you're right. All these things that were either born because of economic crisis, Cold War, geopolitical events, they have to adapt themselves to this new world where now the security challenges are going to be different, right? They are going to be cyber attacks, pandemics, meteors, these type of things. So I fully agree with you. Somehow either these bodies, these institutions should adapt to this new world, or there should be a new institution that will take care of these issues.
Exactly, yeah. I want to go into another working paper that you have, COVID-19 and emerging markets, SIR model, demand shocks and capital flows, in which you say we quantify the macroeconomic effects of COVID-19 for emerging markets using a framework that combines SIR model with data on international and intersectoral linkages for a small open economy. And you're looking at Turkey here. So what do you find in the context of Turkey?
So what we want to highlight in that paper is the importance of foreign demand, external demand for emerging markets like Turkey. So the most visible form of that will be tourism, right? I mean, so these countries are now going to be in big trouble because they are going to lose a lot of tourism revenue because of COVID. And we were trying to argue in that paper, look, these countries' products are demanded by foreigners too, and now with COVID, that demand is going to be disappearing. And they also, at the same time, have to deal with the COVID in their own countries, right? They have to provide these packages to workers, firms, all these programs that rich countries did. But unfortunately, these countries, they don't have the fiscal space, right? They don't have that much trillions of packages they can put on the table as Biden administration doing right now for families, for workers, for firms, for jobs, right? So they don't have that type of funds. And at the same time, they are going to be suffering a double value, right? Their own restaurants, gyms, all that is going to be closed, exactly as in the US. Plus, they're also going to lose from this foreign demand side because, they are going to lose on tourism. They cannot sell their, exports because foreigners are not going to want those. Okay, so then we said, how you deal with this? And then we said capital flows is very important here, right? So that limited domestic fiscal space can be covered by or filled by, that hole can be filled by capital flow. So basically by foreign investors providing that financing that those countries need instead of they are trying to raise that financing domestically when they also be losing things like tourism revenue. So that is the point we were making. And here also actually the US monetary policy plays a big role, because if you remember early in the pandemic, of course, there was a huge uncertainty like March, April, May, and investors, foreign investors, global investors, they didn't want to be investing in countries like Turkey because they just were afraid that, this is just going to be a huge shock, huge crisis, huge financial crisis like 2008. So they all basically came back home. And these type of times everybody actually comes back to US and comes back to US dollar as the safe haven. So, but then because US monetary policy show a tremendous stimulative action, we realize, and those global investors also realize, that we are not going to have a financial crisis. This is not 2008 anymore. So they realize that they can go back and invest in countries like, Turkey, Brazil, and Argentina and all. So that's the point you were making in the paper. This is actually a very good thing. So here, US monetary policy is, without knowing, really helping these emerging markets like Turkey, because capital flows can come back to those countries and help with their financing needs when they are limited domestically in raising finance. And that's actually exactly what happened. I mean, we wrote that paper very early But if you look at the second half of the year after May and June, capital flows really flow to emerging markets. Many of them raised record funding, actually, which really helped them in terms of this limited domestic fiscal space.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really complex, I don't quite understand it, Sebnem, but a very complex issue. So when capital flows sort of dry out, it is sort of interconnected with supply chain, the global supply, right?
Yes.
So, a multinational set up a manufacturing facility in country X gets a shock, and capital flows sort of dry out. It sort of loop back on the multinational from a supply chain risk perspective. But the countries where this company is based don't really have optimum policy. So everything is sort of a interconnected system, but we don't have an entity that is able to look at all of this interconnectedness, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, of course, on the good side, WTO is kind of the watchdog here, that entity that makes sure the trade is, fair and, everybody plays by the rules. But on the finance side, I mean, again, IMF and World Bank to a degree, but they are more about the government financing, right? When governments borrow from governments or governments borrow from World Bank, IMF. So when capital flows are between two governments, when private investors involved and multinationals involved, right? Exactly like you were saying. So now you have private bodies on both sides of the transaction, right? There's a company in Brazil or Turkey, a private company, that company borrows from, say, JP Morgan, a financier, or a multinational where that company can become an affiliate of that multinational. So clearly, no international body can interfere into this transaction. This is a transaction between two private bodies. But at the end, if the lender side is a multinational company, or JP Morgan's, any financiers like that, of course, you're right, they are not the ones that got hurt at the end. The domestic company, the private firm in Brazil, Turkey, they are the ones who are losing this financing, these capital flows, and they are the ones who end up being hurt at the end. So I mean, again, it is a very, very good question. To ask that, is this optimal, right? Should we have a international body looking at these things? I mean, it is tough, right? So it is not clear, because at the end of the day, if you do that, you are going to be in a private transaction. So, and then, there can be a response to that. Well, that may not be optimal either. I mean, these are two private bodies engaging in a transaction. They must be optimizing for themselves. I mean, that's how, economists think. That's why we like the markets, and we don't want so much interference with markets as long as markets work. So here, of course, if we think it is similar to WTO, why we have WTO? Because we believe some countries don't play the trade by the rules, right? They cheat, and they that's why we have to watch the trade. So, but maybe here also multinationals don't play by the rules. They don't pay their taxes. Maybe they somehow abuse those domestic firms. So that does require, in that sense, if that is the case, so that means, again, this market is not working. Even this is a market where the transaction is between two private bodies. If it is not working properly, then of course we do need a body to govern this. But I think that is the thing that is hard to show, right? To prove that this market is not working.
Yeah. So I have a sort of a modeling question. It's not in the paper, but so if you take a developing country, let's say it's India, Turkey, Brazil, it doesn't really matter. Is there some sort of a step function change? So there is a worldwide discontinuity. Let's say it's a pandemic or something else. Is there, sort of a critical point at which a developing market is going to completely collapse? For a variety of reasons, as you mentioned, capital flows. If it has supply chain intermediaries there, they don't have operating capabilities. So do you think there is sort of a critical point in which a developing market could completely collapse? I mean, I know that's a pessimistic question, but I'm just I'm just wondering.
Right. No, we used to work with these models actually in the old days. They are known also multiple equilibria or development trap models, where there is that critical point where everything goes wrong and you go to that bad equilibrium where you collapse. I mean, we have real life examples of that, failed states. I mean, the countries that nothing works. I mean, the recent example would be Venezuela, right?
Yeah.
So when that happened, we cannot tell you, these models cannot tell you there is this threshold, like, okay, look at 5 variables, and when they are this value, it will be the case, like, GDP, capital flows, trade. If they are like that, then that's going to be the bad equilibrium. We don't have those type of threshold, but we do know what type of governing structure pushes countries to those points, okay? And then the most important thing here is the institutions. Good quality institutions, property right protection, because those are the things that support technology, education, and ideas. And once that starts disappearing, that's exactly where these countries start going to that bad equilibrium of complete collapse and disappearing. So that we know, because you need to have again, as I said, these are these type of multiple equilibrium thinking, because that is also a good equilibrium. You can be in a very bad shape, but then you can be in a very good shape, like Korea, right? Korea is always the example given, because the country divided into two, and one part did great, and the other part, where it is right now. So North Korea and South Korea story. So the critical thing here is that you need to keep inventing, you need to keep have ideas, you need to have technological progress, education, and for those things to happen, you have to have democracy and property rights in your country. Once you start failing on those, then everything starts going downhill. Actually, that we know from the entire last 20, 30 years of economic research.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Sebnem. So there is a sort of a foundational set of characteristics that work like insurance, technology, infrastructure, education, information. And when you don't have those foundational characteristics, you're at a higher risk in a discontinuity. You could fail completely.
Yes, exactly.
And so does that have any implication? So we haven't really seen things take off in Africa as part of the COVID-19 shock. I'm not studying this. I'm making a statement. I don't know if it's true.
I think Africa is a good example. Yes, Africa could have been worse, right? I mean, if it again, and one of the reasons now why India is so bad, they are saying, is apart from the leadership mistakes made, is the weak public health infrastructure, right? So given that Africa also has it very weak, I mean, there are African countries, they don't even have ICU units or ventilators, right? So the early prediction is Africa is going to be horrible. I mean, it's going to be like the worst case scenario for COVID. It didn't happen because I think, again, this is where, again, leadership and vision comes. But in their case, though, because of experience, right? I think Africa dealt with so many other diseases and these type of public health issues, even though they lack the infrastructure, they understand that they cannot deal with it if it comes to this level. So they understand that very well, because it happened to them before. And that's why they act very early. I mean, the mask wearing was amazing, right? I mean, if you look at it, the best countries in terms of mask wearing is the Asian countries and the African countries early on. So that, of course, helped a lot when, I mean, if you are in a country where half of the population doesn't wear masks, I mean, there's so much you can do. If everybody is so diligent on this from the start, that helps a lot. I think that really helped them, kind of this having the experience with diseases and the viruses, and knowing that they won't be able to deal with it if it becomes at an astronomical level. They kind of did a lot of precautions early on.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So the Westernization, from a cultural perspective, sort of acts like an amplification effect. And we have seen that in Asia, and you are sort of optimistic that we will see that in Africa too. I have to say I'm sort of puzzled by the lag. maybe we don't have the right numbers.
Of course, no, I agree. I mean, like 3 months down the road, we might see an Africa looking like India, right? So, because first, we don't know the right numbers. Second, everything is lagging. Third, people relax, right? Even they were wearing masks at the beginning, and they were trying to keep things under control. By the time when the time passes, you stop doing these things. Plus, now, we are getting into summer. There's more travel. I mean, Africa is also a place where generally less travel than the other countries, but there can be more travel now. So of course, I mean, we can definitely see a time bomb there. So the thing is, this is the problem with this thing, right? It is just so much uncertainty. I mean, that's why exactly from the start, always virus ahead and humanity behind, because there's always so much uncertainty, and there's always this, policy mistakes, combined with disease lagging in certain countries after other countries. And instead of trying to apply, what other countries learn to your own country, everybody just goes to their own way, right? That's also, I think, a big mistake. But that's exactly why these things happen. I mean, like, in India's case, right? We knew before, when countries relax and decided that, oh, we want this, and start doing all these big gatherings, there was another wave. I mean, US went through this, Europe went through this. So, but still happened in India, right? So that's this is like mind-blowing. I don't understand how countries don't learn from the mistakes of each other, right? I mean, like, so I mean, like, and the best example, of course, is at the start, right? I mean, when Italy, I mean, like, Italy was telling the whole world, no, this is not just a small thing, and nobody did anything. I mean, Italy should have been a wake-up call last year when clearly this thing is not in China. I mean, everybody was still saying, oh, yeah, but maybe. I mean, nobody did anything. So except scientists. And if you think about last year, that moment, February, March, April, it looks like the only people who were working are the scientists who were trying to find the vaccine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising to me, Sebnem. I don't think humans ever learn.
Yeah.
If this were to happen five years from now, I'll put money on exactly the same things happening again.
Yeah, so sad, so sad.
It is sad. So we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about monetary policy and your other paper.
Great, thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So, Sebnem, we are back. We were talking about COVID-19 and policy issues around that, not just in one country, but around the world, and how we may have missed the mark in many ways around the world. So you have a couple of other papers which is more focused domestically. So one paper is Risk-Taking and Monetary Policy Transmission, Evidence from Loans to SMEs and Large Firms, in which you say, using confidential regulatory firm bank loan level data from the US, we document 4 new facts about the credit market. So what do you find in the credit markets?
Yes, so this is actually part of my research that I have been involved a long time, since the 2008 Lehman crisis.
Yeah.
I work with European data first, because Europeans require small firms, small, medium enterprises. These are the firms, with less than 500 employees, to file their financial accounts and to public registry. So as researchers, we can access that information, and we can look at issues such as if these firms borrow a lot, is there a debt overhang issue? And especially after the 2008-2010 crisis, these issues were a really big deal in Europe. So I did several papers on that. At the time, of course, I wanted to work with the US firms too, but as I said, in US, the only publicly listed companies in the stock exchange required to file their financials. So we only have information about those, and those are, of course, very large firms, right? If you want a number, average size of a publicly listed company is 3,000 employee, whereas when you look at the census and small business administration data, average size there is 12 employee. So clearly, you know, just looking at the listed company is not going to tell you what is going on in the main street, in the world of SMEs, small medium enterprises, and we saw it very clearly at the beginning of the crisis, right? So stock market is breaking record after record early in COVID. I mean, still is. Whereas we also saw this huge increase in unemployment, total disconnect of Wall Street and Main Street. Why? Because the Main Street companies, the companies that are responsible for jobs and employment, are not listed companies. So I was trying to get at the bottom of this for a long time in the US, but the data wasn't there. So finally, actually, we now have the data. Federal Reserve collects this data as part of the stress testing exercise. Actually, they started doing it after the 2008 Lehman collapse as part of the Dodd-Frank Act. So, and now researchers can work with this data. Of course, we are joining forces with researchers at the Federal Reserve. I have two co-authors on this paper who work at Federal Reserve. And we look at this data, try to understand the credit markets, loan markets in the US, and how these small medium enterprises finance their growth. And we find that actually they are bank dependent. They borrow from banks, and they are collateral constrained, meaning when they borrow, it is hard for them to put down a collateral like land or factories or physical assets, because these are small medium enterprises. So most of the time they put their enterprise value, meaning they put a claim to their productivity. If they are successful, then basically that's the claim, right? If they are not, then the bank is going to take away everything they have. But basically there's the collateral on the table, so that's why it's hard for them to borrow. And also they are really they like low interest rates, because low interest rates make them easy to service their debt, so they borrow more. And one of the very striking facts we show in that paper is after the Lehman crisis, because interest rates basically and being zero in the US and stayed low for a long time, these firms, SMEs, did borrow a lot, and they increased their leverage actually, which can be an issue, right? It can consider financial stability risk going forward, especially when there is a shock like COVID on the table right now, because these firms are going to be mostly in service sectors. They are small, so revenue is very important to them, and if they cannot have their revenue, they can be close to bankruptcy and so forth. So in that sense, so far, what has been done on the policy side in terms of helping these firms was very good. All these programs like PPP and all designed to help these type of firms.
Yeah. So you say in the paper that when monetary policy is expansionary, banks do not lend differently to risky and non-risky firms, whether they are private SMEs or public listed firms. Instead, risk-taking is driven by credit demand, since SMEs who lack collateral in terms of physical assets increase their leverage due to low interest rates, which increases their ability to pay back the loan. So are you saying the monetary policy being expansionary doesn't necessarily have a huge effect?
I mean, it does, but not through the channel we thought. So that's the big result we are finding, because there was all this narrative, monetary policy being expansionary is not good. These zero interest rates, no good. In fact, we even have a name for it: too low for too long, too low for too long. So too low interest rates for too long is not good. Why? Because banks are going to take risk, because banks cannot make money under these very low interest rates. So they are going to go and find out risky customers. They are going to lend to risky firms so that they can charge a premium on that low rate, right? So we find actually banks don't do that. I mean, I don't know, maybe in the old days they used to do that, but our data starts after the crisis. Our data starts in 2013. And at that time, banks were pretty much regulated, pretty heavily regulated across the rich world, not just US, but also in Europe. So in our sample, starting 2013, actually banks are not out there to find the extra risky customer. They are out there to find the extra customer. Of course, their business model is like to get an extra customer, but not necessarily that customer has to be a risky customer. So we actually find that, this low interest and expansion of monetary policy can be dangerous. Yes, you're right, but not because banks are playing this game, but rather these small firms who are normal time constrained firms now say, oh, gee, I mean, now I can borrow because I can borrow at 1%. Before it was like borrowing at 5%. So, I didn't think about borrowing before, but now I can because I can pay this at 1%, right? That's what is happening. That's the effect we are finding. Yeah.
So they increase the leverage. So that action of increasing their leverage also increases the probability of going bankrupt?
True. I mean, this is exactly why COVID is very dangerous, right? So because if you increase your leverage as a small, medium-sized enterprise, then your default probability goes up. Actually, leverage is something directly linked to default probability. Bankruptcy likelihood is going to be higher. You're exactly right. And any bad shock is going to make you come quickly to that point, because you are going to, bad shock being you are a shock that makes you lose your revenue. So in that sense, actually, COVID came at a very bad juncture in US economy when these guys, these small, medium enterprises increased their leverage since 2013, 2014. Yes.
Mm. And so this is sort of a double whammy. You increase your leverage and then you get a shock, you're going to go bankrupt. So you have another paper in 2020, COVID-19 and SME failures. It is sort of finding that, right?
Yes. So, of course, what happened in 2020 is, policymakers understood this. Look, all these SMEs can go bankrupt right now. We should do something. And they put a lot of policy packages on the table. I mean, in US, there was the PPP, there was other Main Street programs. In Europe, there were several things like Solidarity Fund, Recovery Fund. Many countries did these government-backed loans, government-guaranteed loans. So realizing this point. So that paper is trying to show actually governments did good on that. So in terms of providing support to SMEs with these packages, they actually did the right call. This was the right decision, because now if you look at the real-time bankruptcy numbers in 2020, they are very low. Actually, several countries even stopped bankruptcy proceedings. I mean, Germany said, I'm not allowing any firm to file for bankruptcy. I'm going to help you. So in that sense, we didn't observe any bankruptcy because governments intervened heavily here, and rightly so. So the paper is trying to make the point that this is actually good policy, because if they wouldn't have done that, what would have happened? So paper works a counterfactual exercise where if none of this support were put on the table, what would be the SME bankruptcy rate? And it's huge. We estimate a almost 10 percentage point increase in SME bankruptcy rate. So just to give you a perspective, normal time bankruptcy rate for these firms in all the countries actually varies between 6% and 10%. So in a normal business cycle, 6 to 10% of SMEs go bankrupt. Okay, so COVID, in the absence of any government intervention policy support, would have increased this to almost 20-25%. So there is like a 10 percentage point increase in the bankruptcy rate in the absence of government intervention. So it didn't happen because of the government intervention. That's what the paper shows.
Yeah, I also find interesting in the paper you say we evaluate the cost and effectiveness of various policy interventions. You say the final cost of an intervention that narrowly targets at-risk firms can be modest, 0.54% of GDP. However, at a similar level of effectiveness, non-targeted subsidies can be substantially more expensive, 1.82% of GDP. I remember when PPP loans were put in place, there was a large education institution in the Northeast, which shall remain nameless,
Yeah.
first in line to to get a PPP loan of $150 million. They had no shame to take that money. They never returned that money. And so these programs have been put in place sort of blanket, without any sort of constraints on the size of the firm and things like that, could be quite expensive for taxpayers.
Exactly. And that part of the paper is trying to do exactly that. So we are economists. We want to do things efficiently. And then we said in that part of the paper, okay, let's compare all these interventions. Most of them are going to be these government-backed loans, government-guaranteed loans. Some of them work as direct grants. PPP has that type of a dimension. If you keep your employment, it becomes a cash grant. Some of them work as subsidizing part of your employment. So they were different policies. In fact, if you look at these trackers among G20 countries, there were 500 different policy packages put on the table. As a huge number. So we try to compare the basic ones, 4 or 5 ones. If like a loan is better than a cash grant or a subsidy. And what we find is exactly what you were saying. You do save the same amount of firms. That is not the point, but at what cost, right? When you do these blanket subsidies and okay, here's the money, or cash grants, that everybody take it, then of course it becomes very costly to taxpayers, exactly as you were saying. Instead, if you would have done targeted, now of course we can do that in our paper because we have a model and we can pinpoint which firm is failing because of COVID and which firm would have been failed anyway without COVID, or which firm would be just fine without COVID. So we can separate these firms, and then we do an exercise of a targeted intervention. So government only goes and saves those firms with cash grant, and that is actually, you are saving the right firms and you are costing very little, right? So that has very little fiscal cost. But of course, again, this is not practical because we don't have these systems in place, right? I mean, if you want to go and save only those firms, which are those firms? They are like restaurants, gyms, your dentist, daycare, right? These firms were completely fine without COVID. You have to go and find these firms and you have to give only them the money and not the others. So your nameless institution in Boston wasn't the only problem. There were also many firms who should have been bankrupt even without COVID, right? These kind of the firms we call zombies, they also got help, right? So in that sense, that type of a surgical procedure with that type of precision wasn't possible then, because we don't have a system in place that says, okay, look, let me look at the tax records and these firms' profits and productivity and decide if this is a viable firm or not. So I will give the money only to that firm. So since that cannot be done, it end up actually, it is going to cost, more than it should to taxpayers. Yeah, correct.
Yeah, so in conclusion, Sebnem, let me ask you this. When COVID-30 comes around, what are the specific things that you would say the world has to really think about? My pessimistic view is that we will have the same kind of politicians leading large countries with an objective function of a single factor objective function of getting elected down the road. They don't particularly care about people. So we'll have the same type of politicians, just like we do today, in power. So when COVID-30 comes around, what do you think what could we do to make the situation better?
You're exactly right. COVID-30 is in 10 years, so I don't think in 10 years we are going to improve on the politician side. We are going to have in terms of the world, probably you're right, we are going to have these politicians who only think about being elected. But for COVID, I don't know, maybe for COVID-50, we can do better. I mean, the only solution to this is education. I mean, we can only get through this by education and educating the voter, right? I mean, since you cannot take away voting rights of anyone, I mean, the way to do is to educate everyone so that, people really will put their vote in an educated way. So that I'm hoping we will achieve by, COVID-50. I mean, COVID-30, I am hoping that we will achieve this international organization we talk about, right? Some sort of body with resources and power that we can do. And on top of all the public health issues and following what is going on and try to catch these things, if not before, right when it's happening. So world mobilizes exactly then. I mean, look at the time we lost with this, right? I mean, if we mobilized January 2020, we wouldn't be in this shape, right? I mean, at that point, like, everybody was making fun of this. Everybody was like, oh, this is just something only in China. So that, I think, should be avoided for COVID-30 for sure.
Yeah. I think that is one change. People at least can see now how diseases can spread really, really fast across the world.
Yeah.
It is a worldwide problem, so you cannot really solve it in a segmented way. I think, there was some sort of maybe false expectation or information after we had, I can't remember the name of the disease in Africa, that wasn't very highly transmissible. It was highly contained. Whereas, we are going to get highly transmissible diseases like COVID in the future, and that is not containable by country or county. So at least hopefully we'll remember that in the next time.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and I hope so, definitely.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Sebnem. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you, Jill. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.